Hi, my name is Daniel Webben. I'm coming to you from Segovia. Unfortunately, I won't be able to make it into Madrid today. And obviously, your classes have changed. The whole world has changed a lot in the last week. Uh, I'm happy to be talking to you today. The title of my talk is A Spark of Being into a Lifeless Thing, Shocking Bodies and Electric Texts of the 19th Century. While my interest is in electricity and the kind of cultural history of electricity, both from the very beginnings of the scientific understanding up into modern energy networks, today I'm going to be focusing on two novels, Frankenstein and Dracula. And with me, I have two special guests, Michaela and Luke. So electricity is both a noun and a verb. As a noun, it can either be a form of energy resulting from the existence of charged particles or a state of feeling and excitement. The first definition is much easier to imagine and visualize. It's that state or feeling of excitement that's harder for us to sometimes either put into words or to show one another. But we all know what it is, right? When there's electricity in the air, or we're feeling that a relationship or some kind of event is electric. But we oftentimes use the first definition, the charged particles, in order to show that. Of course, to electrify as a verb means to impress, excite, or arouse, or to charge with electricity. And so from the very early understandings of electricity and electric phenomena, we thought of electrifying as a form of that emotional electricity. And so Thomas Jefferson later recalls that the first days of the revolution are like a shock of electricity, arousing every man and placing him erect and solidly on his center. And so we'll see this also in the novels, the way in which electricity and this idea of shocking disables rational thought, and sometimes that is for good, and sometimes that's very challenging. So, thinking about the way in which electricity kind of is positioned in the 19th century, and especially in 19th century literature, we can recognize that electricity in the body is emotional, it's sensational, it's erotic, and it's irrational. But outside of us, the electricity that comes from the heavens is seemingly scientific and rational and also lethal and even sublime. And so my kind of thesis here is that electric language, and the electric language that we find in these novels, it shocks, it resonates, it charges, it sparks, and that it forms this kind of mysterious, contagious, shocking phenomena. It also, for these particular novels and for the course that you're in, it mirrors the monstrous and the way in which that kind of proliferates both as body and text. So overall, if there's one thing that you should leave with, hopefully, it's that at least when we're talking about electricity in the 19th century, it's that electricity is something to think about, right, as a scientific phenomena, but it's also something that's embodied. It's something that we should think with. So the first kind of broad overview of electrical science starts with Galvani and Volta. Galvani is in the late 18th century, inspired by some of the experiments of Thomas Jefferson and his electric kite, actually ends up touching brass and steel as he's dissecting a frog, and the leg twitches. He goes on to do a series of experiments, including trying to repeat the lightning experiment of Franklin, in which he hooks up a frog to a wire, puts it outside during a thunderstorm, and there's these shocks or charges, and the frog seems to like jump up and down. So he thinks that he's found the animal electricity or the force which kind of drives all life. He publishes his ideas about animal electricity. Meanwhile, Volta at the same time disagrees, right, with this idea of animal electricity. So while Galvani had animal electricity, and he explained this, that it was an interruption of the electric fluid in the muscles, It was Volta who said that no, it's not actually electricity or animal electricity, like it's some different kind of electricity, but that it was actually the charged particles, the ions, right, within a nerve that were moving and that were excited. In other words, that the muscles were still a good conductor for the electricity and the current that was going through them. It was, because of this debate between Galvani and Volta, that Volta created the first battery that was able to produce electrical current, and this was known as the voltaic pile. It was basically stacks of copper and zinc with some kind of wet intermediary. They're able to create the first batteries. And so all of this is happening right around the time that Shelley is going to be thinking about Frankenstein and writing this novel. And so, again, during this time, and this is an amazing book on kind of electricity and the way in which it shaped thinking in the United States. Electricity was, again, a mysterious force. It merged science and myth. It was both the lightning bolts of Zeus, the wrath of the gods, and in creating lightning rods, it was a way to kind of escape the wrath of the gods. It was also a really important public spectacle. And so people would join in these parlors or in, what would be like pre-scientific laboratories and watch people who had a battery shock things or make sparks. We have to imagine that this is before the time of much entertainment. This was one of the greatest things that you could use a machine for, right? That was not mechanical necessarily. This brings us to the inspiration for Frankenstein. Of course, as you probably know, Lake Geneva in 1816, the summer without a winter because of a volcanic eruption. Lord Byron invites the Shelleys, and a number of people are at a party, and he proposes that they all try to write a horror tale. It is a couple years later that Mary Shelley takes that idea and publishes Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus. Now, the Shelleys were both scientifically inclined before writing Frankenstein. In fact, about the same time she made this summer visit, Mary Shelley had been reading Humphrey Davy's Elements of Chemical Philosophy, as well as Locke's Essay on Human Understanding. And there's many secondary articles about the ways in which these influenced her idea of the monster of the being. Meanwhile, Percy Shelley, the poet, was also aware of Erasmus Darwin and his ideas about this animation of life. And he says, while he doesn't say that electricity can animate life, he doesn't side completely with Giovanni. He says it's not impossible. He also used some of these batteries to electrocute people that he knew. In other words, he tried to practice electricity and electrocution. I mean, we're talking about very, very low current, low voltage batteries, but could still shock somebody. And that, again, it was a form of both experiment, but also entertainment. So when Mary writes about Victor, he is in college. He's doing a bunch of pseudoscientific research at first, and then kind of shifts into more scientific research. This was an age, at least in scientific circles and in medicine, in which grave robbing and working on cadavers was happening. I mean, it was really the only way to have an anatomy class for some people. And so Victor comes in and he hears a lecture about electricity and galvanism. And it seems as if like this was kind of far reaches of knowledge. It's really Victor's father that kind of shows him about electricity with this electrical machine and kind of repeating some of the experiments of Einstein. Again, these experiments were happening on cadavers, on bodies, contemporaneously. Of course, there's no way of knowing how much of that Mary Shelley and Victor had, or Mary and Percy had seen firsthand. The most electrical scene in Frankenstein comes during the lightning. And Victor talks about this time of being very young and being in this thunderstorm and going outside and watching a bolt come down through the sky and tear apart this old oak tree. I think it's important here that he talks about this dazzling light vanished and the oak had disappeared. And so it didn't go from, lightning bolt to splintered wood to fire to something else. In other words, it almost like instantly vanished. And it's that idea of a sublime moment, something that is both fearful and shocking, but also this act of sublimation, right? And so sublimation meaning when something will pass from one state directly into another and kind of skip the intermediary. So like from a solid into a gas. And I think that kind of underlies what his being or his monster, his creation is, right? That in creating it and giving it this spark of life, these body parts, the spark of life, he's in a way kind of skipped one of the steps in kind of natural growth or birth or life. And so then we get to the crucial moment, right, where young Victor kind of is with his collection of body parts that he's arranged so beautifully. And he says that he has the instruments of life and infuses a spark of being into the lifeless thing. Of course, this is when the watery eyes open and the monster becomes alive, so to speak. Of course, from there on out, the tale kind of unfolds with Victor and his creation becoming kind of nemeses or antagonists. And I think it's important to kind of, if we think about this idea of morality and who is the monster really in this novel, it's that as the novel opens, it's really Victor, right, who has become the monster figure, in that he is wretched, right, when Robert Walton discovers him in the Arctic. Furthermore, it's the monster who is very eloquent in the novel, not so much in the movies. In the movies, it's more just grunts and noises, but in the novel, he's very eloquent, and he makes this case to Victor, where, he says, you have made me this way, and I am thy creature. He is the offspring of Victor, and he explains that he was made good, right? But that it's the circumstances that have turned him into this, murderous monster. And so the question then is Frankenstein an electric text? There's a recent scholarly article by Ulf Howe, Frankenstein Without Electricity. And the argument is that, spark of being and instruments of life are not necessarily electricity, and kind of draws this back to some of the comments by Darwin and other contemporaneous thinkers, and saying this could have also been heat. But ultimately, Shelley did not make explicit the connection of electricity in the novel, possibly because the focus was supposed to be more about the way in which life is animated and the way in which human beings as a species are different than other animals, that it's not just that we are animated or have this spark of life, but that we were ultimately social, right? And so monsters are not made by their parts. It's, in fact, they're made through social arrangements. And so what I think is interesting, though, is that this spark of life or spark of being precedes the shock of living. And so it's the electric language that I would say makes this such an electric text. And so it is Victor who talks about that he has these sudden shocks of misery. And it's also the monster who thinks about this dazzling light, and it's as if it's a bolt that's entered his soul. And even he talks about kind of survival and his ability to overcome obstacles as this ability to resist so many shocks, which are the torture for him as he lives. Um, of course, this will tie us into Dracula, right? Where Jonathan Harker talks about these various shocks that he feels once he gets to the Count's house. And he thinks of his mind, right, becoming unhinged, and the shock, which must end in its undoing. And so this idea of losing one's mind is also related to this language of electricity. And in fact, the word shock appears in those diary entries and the letters that Jonathan's writing from the Count's castle 5 different times just in that chapter 3. So let's turn to Dracula and Bram Stoker's networks. So of course, this is an epistolary novel. It's written as a collection of different documents. We have captain ship's logs, letters, diary entries, transcribed voice recordings, telegrams, interviews, newspaper clippings, etc. We also have this kind of team or cast of characters. There's not just one single hero. It's all of them: Jonathan Harker, Mina, his wife, who is the typist and becomes the recording angel, Dr. Seward and his patient Renfield, Quincy Morris, the American, Van Helsing, and Lucy, who's kind of the patient zero. And they each write differently, but they each talk about the ability of writing to help them clear their thoughts, make sure that they're sane, but also as a way to remember what has just happened to them because it seems so disorienting. And ultimately, writing is the way in which they know that they're going to have to defeat Dracula. In addition to that, in addition to the writing, kind of the web of writing that happens in here, it's also interesting that they're consistently talking about communicating via wire. They use that word wire both as a noun and a verb. I received a wire, or I will wire you more information. Just a small, you probably already know this, Vlad, the actual person, real life person, Dracula, was a pretty bad individual, but did not actually suck the blood of his enemies, but did participate in some kind of gruesome acts. But again, that might be beside the point of today's talk. Dracula is a narrative of interconnected parts, and they begin to kind of collide and pulse like a body. So the hunters in Dracula are kind of going after one another, and they both kind of create these webs or these traps or these networks. So Dracula is using his knowledge of laws and real estate contracts and shipping of the coffins, as well as letters, and then the train schedules in order to move around and create his web. Meanwhile, the others, Jonathan and Mina and the other hunters are trying to collect their own set of transcripts and to record and archive their experiences in order to defeat Dracula. Another way in which Dracula kind of exhibits some of this electrical energy of the 19th century is through the idea of animal magnetism. Now, it was commonly believed that you could hypnotize someone or use the kind of electrical fluid or electrical energy within one mind or one body in order to control or influence another. And we would see this most often. Again, it was another kind of parlor trick where somebody would be hypnotized and they would be under the influence. This is very much kind of a wireless electricity, right? It was kind of like a force field that one individual could create in order to control another one. And we see that most clearly through Renfield and Dracula. Dracula is able to kind of call to him and communicate him wirelessly, almost through telepathy. And sometimes just by, we could almost imagine like looking in that direction. And as the novel progresses, we see these kind of two competing webs begin to spread. Dracula creates his kind of positions or his little nodes of coffins and the undead. He's also writing on bodies. The marks that he's putting on Lucy and others are kind of leaving behind his mark. And ultimately, while his kind of web or network fails, he's able to kind of transcend the network in a way that's also akin, again, to electricity, in that he says that, he isn't bound by the kind of constraints of time. We also get a very kind of clear, if Victor wasn't clear in that electrical science related to his creation of the being, Van Helsing kind of talks about the undead and the role of Dracula as this kind of occult force, and these things which are done in electrical science as a specific kind of mirror to what's happening with Dracula and the undead. And of course, throughout the 19th century, electricity remained this kind of super mysterious, was it a force or a fluid or a phenomenon, because they didn't know exactly what charged particles were and how they operated. It was still mysterious at that time. Of course, he thinks about the ways in which the undead can stay undead. And it's full of this strangeness of the geologic and chemical world. There are deep caverns and fissures that reach none know whither. Doubtless there is something magnetic or electric in some of these combinations of occult forces. And so he kind of bases the monstrosity of Dracula back on this idea of electricity. And so now here we are. This, I'm talking to you, I'm recording this thanks to electricity. I'm going to send it through an electrical network. It's only our connections through electricity that are allowing this to happen at the same time. The reason why we're not standing in the same room together is because of a different kind of spread, a different kind of contagion, a different kind of network that's currently spreading across the world. And is as scary as anything most of us have ever faced. And so I'm very conscious of that as I'm trying to kind of make these connections about electricity and excitement and sublime and fear, and what happens when something, both a text or an idea or an actual virus, spreads uncontrollably or goes viral. And so some of the questions that I want to leave you with are, how are these progeny or offspring, both the monsters and the undead, but also the actual texts, Shelley's Frankenstein and Stokers Dracula, how do they get spread organically, right? How do we give books to one another? And how are they spread electrically, right? Through websites or videos or talks, and what might be different about those and how the original relates to the reproduction. Also, how might electricity and electric technologies help us understand the ways in which ideas spread now, or have spread really since the late 19th century through different electrical networks? Were there other did you notice the electric language in these novels? Is that something else that came up, or is there a whole other subset of language and themes and ideas? I'm actually really curious to know what you all thought of these two books. How might modern technologies, telephones, televisions, smartphones offer new opportunities for tension and horror? I'm really curious about this idea of, the horror movie in which the person's calling on the phone and then the line goes dead, and how that doesn't really work as a narrative device anymore now that everything is wireless. And then finally, how do we read these books of contagion and viral spread and monstrosity in the age that we're currently going through in this, global crisis. So again, I wish I could be there with you and talk through this with you, but I'm really happy to be able to share this, and I look forward to hearing what you think about the novel. Thanks.